The meeting had already started when Dr. Nia Cole walked in. She was 40 seconds late. A trauma consult had run over, the kind of thing that happened in a hospital where the patients didn't schedule their emergencies around department meeting times. She slid into the nearest empty seat along the left wall of the conference room, set her tablet on the table, and found her place in the agenda without looking up. She didn't notice the room's temperature until she reached for her coffee and realized nobody around her was moving. 12 members of Seoul Central's surgical board, arranged around a long glass table that reflected the overhead lights in twin rows of cold white. Dr. Choi Byung-soo at the far end, standing, one hand resting on the table with the proprietary ease of a man who'd been comfortable in this room for 20 years. Director Han Soo-yeon seated to his right, a closed folder in front of her, her face doing something careful and watchful that Nia couldn't immediately read. Everyone was already looking at her. Not the way people look at someone who arrived late, the way people look at someone who has walked into a room that was already about them. "Dr. Cole," Choi said, "thank you for joining us." Something in his voice was wrong, too even, the particular evenness of a man who had prepared his voice before using it. "Of course," Nia said. She set her coffee down. "What did I miss?" "We were just beginning to discuss," Choi said, reaching for a document in front of him and sliding it toward the center of the table without quite releasing it. "A discrepancy in the outcome report filed last week for patient Lim Young-soo, post-operative cardiac case. You were the attending physician of record." "I was," Nia said. "The report is accurate." "The board has reason to believe it isn't," Choi said. The room stayed very still. Nia looked at the document he was holding, then at his face. Then, briefly, at Director Han, whose expression hadn't changed but whose left hand had moved, just slightly, to rest flat on top of her closed folder. "What reason?" Nia said. "The recovery metrics you documented don't align with the procedural notes from the surgical log," Choi said. "Specifically, the timeline of the patient's stabilization is inconsistent with what the monitoring equipment recorded." He looked up from the document. "In short, Dr. Cole, the report appears to describe an outcome that the clinical data doesn't support." "The clinical data supports it exactly," Nia said. "I can walk through every figure if the board would like." "That won't be necessary at this stage," Choi said, and the speed of it, the practiced speed, the speed of a man who needed that offer declined before anyone could take it up, told Nia everything she needed to understand about what was actually happening in this room. She understood it completely in the space of one breath. He hadn't found a discrepancy in her report. He'd manufactured one. And he'd called this meeting before she arrived specifically, so the board's first impression of this conversation would be shaped by his version of events, not hers. She sat very still, the way she went still in surgery when something unexpected happened, and the only correct response was to stop moving and think before doing anything else. "I'd like to understand the process here," she said, addressing the table rather than Choi specifically. "Has a formal complaint been filed, or is this a preliminary discussion?" "At this stage," Choi said, "the board is recommending a precautionary suspension of your surgical privileges pending a full review of your recent case files." "All of them," Nia said. "As a precaution." She looked at him for a moment, at the document still half extended in his hand, at the 20 years of institutional comfort in his posture, at the specific confidence of a man who had done this before, in smaller ways, and had never once been asked to explain himself afterward. "How long have you been planning this meeting, Dr. Choi?" she asked. The table shifted slightly, the collective adjustment of 12 people registering that the conversation had just changed temperature. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "I think you are," Nia said, "but I'm happy to be specific if that would help the board. If you have ever walked into a room that was already built against you, and felt the moment you understood exactly what you were looking at, comment the word ready below. Subscribe if you believe the woman they thought they could remove quietly deserves to be the one who's still standing when the room clears." Because Dr. Nia Cole had been in this hospital for 2 years, and she was the only Black woman on this surgical floor, and she had fixed a problem 3 weeks ago that she hadn't reported yet. And the man who just recommended her suspension had no idea that the evidence he thought he was burying was the same evidence she'd been deciding how to use. Nia had come to Seoul Central 2 years earlier from Johns Hopkins, where she'd completed a cardiothoracic fellowship that her program director had described, in a recommendation letter she'd never actually read, as the most technically precise work he'd seen in 15 years of training surgeons. She hadn't come for recognition. She'd come because Seoul Central's cardiothoracic program was doing genuinely frontier work in minimally invasive valve repair, and she was the kind of surgeon who followed the work regardless of where it led, even when it led to a city where she'd be the only Black woman in every room she walked into for the foreseeable future. She'd known that going in. She'd made her peace with it the way she made her peace with most difficult things, by deciding that the difficulty was not a reason to go somewhere smaller, and that somewhere smaller was the one thing she was constitutionally incapable of choosing. The surgical floor at Seoul Central was excellent and knew it, which produced both the best work environment she'd ever operated in and the specific atmosphere of a department that had never been seriously challenged from within. The senior surgeons were good. Some of them were exceptional, and they had the particular quality of people who'd been exceptional in the same room for long enough that the room had started to feel like it belonged to them personally. Dr. Choi Byung-soo was the most senior of all of them, 22 years at Seoul Central, department chief for 8, a man whose photograph was on the wall of the hospital's main entrance corridor, alongside the other named department heads, the kind of institutional presence that made junior staff lower their voices slightly when he entered a room without deciding to. He was also, Nia had concluded within her first 6 months, a surgeon who had gotten away with being almost exceptional for so long that he'd stopped being able to distinguish between the two. She'd seen the first signs of it in small things, a procedural shortcut that worked 95% of the time and that he'd apparently stopped worrying about the other 5. A monitoring protocol he'd quietly streamlined in ways that his seniority insulated from question. A habit of filing outcome reports with the kind of confident imprecision that came from never having been asked to justify a number to anyone with the standing to push back. She hadn't said anything. She was 2 years into a department run by a man whose name was on the wall, and she understood, not bitterly, just practically, that a foreign Black woman's first year in a room like that was not the time to start correcting the most senior person in it. Then came patient Lim Young-soo, a 63-year-old man, post-operative day 2 following a valve repair Choi had performed. Nia had been the assisting surgeon, which meant she'd been in that operating room, had seen the entire procedure, had watched the moment Choi's technique produced a complication he'd managed smoothly enough that it wasn't immediately visible in the room. But that Nia, who'd been standing close enough and paying the particular attention she paid to everything, had registered as a problem deferred rather than resolved. She'd checked the monitoring data that evening. Then again the following morning, when a number that should have been trending in one direction was trending in another. She'd gone in herself on post-operative day 1 and made a targeted correction, a procedure that took 40 minutes and that she'd documented precisely in the surgical log under her own name, because it was her work, and she documented her work. She had not, at that point, filed any report connecting the correction to Choi's original procedure. She'd told herself she was waiting until the patient's recovery was fully confirmed. She'd told herself she was being thorough rather than rushed. She'd told herself, if she was being completely honest, that she was still deciding how much institutional capital it was going to cost her to put her name on a document that said the department chief's technique had required a correction on post-operative day 1. She'd also, in the quiet hours of that same night, run a comparative analysis. Her procedural notes against Choi's original operative record, the monitoring timeline, the precise data points where his report and the clinical reality had started to diverge. She'd saved it to a personal encrypted file, time-stamped automatically by the hospital's system, and had been sitting on it for 3 weeks while she decided what to do with it. That had been 3 weeks ago, which meant that Choi Byung-soo had walked into this morning's board meeting to accuse her of falsifying a report, using discrepancies he'd manufactured, by misrepresenting her correction as an inconsistency in her documentation. And he had done it with no idea that she was sitting 20 feet away from him, holding a time-stamped comparative analysis that showed, in clinical detail that left no interpretive room whatsoever, exactly whose error had required correcting and whose report had subsequently tried to bury it. He thought he was removing a problem. He had, instead, handed her a room full of witnesses. Director Han Soo-yeon spoke for the first time since Nia had sat down. "Dr. Cole," she said, her voice carrying the particular measured quality of a woman choosing each word with legal precision. "Before the board moves to any formal recommendation, I want to confirm for the record. Do you have documentation supporting the accuracy of your outcome report for patient Lim Young-soo?" Nia looked at her, found, in Director Han's careful, watchful expression, the thing she hadn't been able to read when she first sat down. Not hostility, not neutrality either. Readiness. The specific readiness of a woman who had been sitting in this room for 2 years with her own folder closed in front of her, waiting for exactly this kind of confirmation before opening it. "I do," Nia said. "All of it," Director Han said, and the slight emphasis on all was so precise and so deliberate that Nia understood, with complete clarity, that Han Soo-yeon knew considerably more about what was in that folder than she'd indicated to anyone else in the room. "All of it," Nia confirmed. Choi set the document down. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, his hand wasn't entirely steady. Nia didn't open her tablet immediately. She'd learned, in 2 years of operating in rooms built by and for other people, that the timing of a move mattered as much as the move itself. She'd learned it in surgery first, the particular discipline of knowing when to cut and when to wait 1 more second, because 1 more second sometimes revealed something that changed everything about where the cut needed to go. She let the silence, after all of it, sit in the room for a full 5 seconds. Long enough for Choi to pick up the document again. Long enough for him to look at it, then at her, then back at it, with the specific expression of a man trying to locate the problem in a calculation he'd been certain was correct. Then she opened her tablet. "I'd like to walk the board through the patient timeline," she said, addressing the table the way she addressed a room during a case presentation. Clear, unhurried, the voice of someone who had prepared for this and was not performing preparation. Starting with the original operative record from Dr. Choi's procedure on the 14th and moving through the monitoring data from post-operative days 1 and 2. "Dr. Cole," Choi said, "I don't think a full case review is necessary at this." "Dr. Choi," Director Han's voice was quiet and absolute. "Please let her continue." He stopped. The board member nearest the window, a cardiologist named Dr. Park, who Nia had worked with twice, and who had the reputation of following evidence wherever it led regardless of whose name was attached, leaned slightly forward. Nia cast her screen to the room's display panel. The first document was her outcome report, the one Choi had accused of containing discrepancies. She walked through it methodically, figure by figure, cross-referencing each data point against the monitoring records as she went: the patient's stabilization timeline, the cardiac rhythm progression, the post-operative inflammatory markers, each number sitting exactly where her report said it sat, confirmed by equipment that had no stake in anyone's career. "The report is accurate," she said, when she'd finished. "Every figure in it corresponds to the clinical data recorded by the monitoring system. If the board has identified a specific discrepancy, I'd welcome the opportunity to address it directly." She looked at Choi. He didn't produce a specific discrepancy. Because there wasn't one, and they both knew it, and now 12 other people in the room were beginning to understand that too. She could see it in the quality of the silence, the slight reorientation of attention away from her and toward the man who'd called the meeting. "The question," Nia continued, "isn't whether my report is accurate. It is. The more relevant question, and I want to be careful here, because I want to be fair to the full clinical picture, is why the patient required a secondary intervention on post-operative day 1. The room shifted. "A secondary intervention," Dr. Park said. "A targeted correction," Nia said. 40 minutes. I performed it on the morning of post-operative day 1, after reviewing the overnight monitoring data and identifying a complication that had not fully resolved during the original procedure. She advanced to the next document on her screen, the surgical log from her correction, time-stamped 7:14 a.m. on post-operative day 1, her name, her notes, her data. This is the procedure I performed. It's documented in full in the surgical log. What it isn't documented in, and this is what I'd like the board to look at carefully, is Dr. Choi's original post-operative report. She advanced again. Choi's post-operative report filled the right half of the screen. Her surgical correction log filled the left. The timestamp of her correction, 7:14 a.m., post-operative day 1, sat in plain view beside Choi's report, which described the patient's post-operative status as uncomplicated, filed at 6:50 p.m. on the day of the original procedure. 24 minutes before Nia had identified the complication that required correction. 18 hours before she'd fixed it. A report that described an uncomplicated recovery, filed before the complication had declared itself, which was procedurally defensible, barely. Except that Nia had one more document. This, she said, advancing a final time, is the comparative analysis I ran on the night of post-operative day 1, after I'd performed the correction and reviewed the full data set. She paused. It shows the point of divergence between the patient's expected post-operative trajectory, based on the monitoring data from the final 30 minutes of the original procedure, and the trajectory Dr. Choi's report described. The divergence begins at 11:23 p.m. on the night of the procedure, which means the complication was developing before the post-operative report was filed, and the data available at the time of filing indicated it. The room was completely silent. I want to be clear about what I'm saying, Nia said, and her voice didn't change register, didn't reach for drama, stayed exactly as measured as it had been at the start. I'm not saying the outcome report Dr. Choi filed was deliberately falsified. I'm saying the clinical data available at the time of filing indicated a complication that the report did not reflect. I'm also saying that the report he produced this morning, claiming discrepancies in my documentation, relies on misrepresenting my correction as an inconsistency rather than what it actually was. A secondary intervention performed to address exactly the complication his report omitted. She closed her tablet. I extended a professional courtesy 3 weeks ago, she said, by not filing a formal incident report connecting my correction to the original procedure. I was giving the clinical picture time to fully resolve before putting anything on paper that I couldn't take back. I regret that courtesy this morning, because it appears to have been interpreted as an opportunity rather than as the goodwill it was intended to be. Choi's face had gone the particular color of a man watching the ground disappear from underneath, a position he'd been standing on confidently for years. Not red, the opposite, a draining rather than a flooding, the color leaving in one slow, even process he clearly couldn't stop. This is, he started, stopped, started again. This analysis is time-stamped, Director Hand said, from her seat to his right. The hospital's system timestamps all documents automatically on creation. The comparative analysis Dr. Cole described was created at 11:58 p.m. on post-operative day 1, 3 weeks before this meeting. She opened her folder, the closed one, the one she'd had her hand on since Nia sat down. I'd like to enter something into the record now, if the board will allow it. Nobody said it wouldn't. She produced a document that was considerably thicker than anything else on the table. 30, maybe 40 pages, Nia estimated, paper-clipped rather than bound. The kind of document assembled over time rather than prepared for a single occasion. Over the past 22 months, Director Hand said, I have been compiling documented instances of procedural irregularities, outcome report discrepancies, and internal complaints from nursing staff and junior residents within this department. I've been waiting for a case in which the clinical evidence was clean enough, the documentation thorough enough, and the incident significant enough to bring to the full board without the risk of it being absorbed and neutralized at the department level. She set the document flat on the table. Dr. Cole's case this morning meets all 3 criteria. I'm formally requesting that this board suspend Dr. Choi's surgical privileges pending a full departmental review, and that the recommendation for Dr. Cole's suspension be withdrawn from the record. Choi stood up. This is an orchestrated. Sit down, Byung-soo. The cardiologist, Dr. Park, said it quietly, without looking up from the documents now being passed around the table. Please. Choi sat down. Not because Dr. Park outranked him, because the room had changed, and even a man with 22 years of institutional comfort could feel the precise moment a room stopped belonging to him. Nia looked at the table, at 12 people reading documents that 3 weeks ago she'd been carrying alone in an encrypted file, deciding whether the cost of using them was one she was willing to pay, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since she'd walked into this meeting 40 minutes ago. Not triumph, something quieter than that. The specific, private satisfaction of a person who prepared for the worst version of a room and found out they'd prepared correctly. Director Han caught her eye across the table. She didn't smile. She simply held the look for one deliberate second, the look of a woman who had been sitting in rooms like this for considerably longer than 2 years, and who recognized, in the surgeon across the table, exactly the kind of person who made what she was holding in that folder finally worth opening. The board took a recess at 10:47 a.m. 40 pages of Director Han's documented irregularities needed reading properly, not skimming, the board chair. A quiet man named Dr. Lim, who'd said almost nothing during the entire preceding hour, called the break with the unhurried authority of someone who understood that the next decision this room made needed to be airtight, and that airtight required time. Nia went to the coffee station in the hallway outside and stood there without pouring anything, looking at the window at the end of the corridor where Seoul's morning was going about its business, with the complete indifference of a city that didn't know or care what was happening in a glass-walled conference room on the 7th floor of a private hospital. Director Han came out 4 minutes into the recess. She didn't approach immediately. She poured coffee first, with the deliberate calm of a woman who'd learned, somewhere along the way, that being seen to rush toward anything communicated weakness she wasn't interested in communicating. Then she came to stand beside Nia at the window, both of them looking out at the same unremarkable Tuesday morning. How long did you know? Nia asked. Not about her folder, about this morning specifically, about what Choi was planning. 3 days, Han said. He filed a preliminary complaint with the board administrator on Friday. I was copied on it, as deputy board chair, which I suspect he considered a formality rather than a risk. She took a measured sip of coffee. He didn't know you and I had spoken. We haven't spoken, Nia said. Not about any of this. No, Han agreed. Which is exactly what I told him when he asked whether I had any conflicts of interest in the review. She looked at the window. I've been watching your work for 14 months, Dr. Cole. Not this case specifically, your work generally. The way you document. The way you follow a clinical question past the point where most people decide they've done enough. The correction you performed on the Lim case was the 4th time in 14 months I've seen you quietly fix something in this department that you didn't cause and didn't have to touch. Nia turned to look at her. You've been watching me fix things, she said slowly. I've been watching you protect patients, Han said, at personal professional cost, without filing incident reports that would have been your right to file and would have caused considerably more disruption than you apparently wanted to cause. She held her cup with both hands, measured and precise. I've also been watching you absorb things a surgeon with less self-possession would have made complaints about long before now. The scheduling irregularities in your first 6 months. The case assignments that consistently gave you the high-complexity work without the corresponding credit in department meetings. The way your name appears in surgical logs as assisting on cases where the clinical notes make clear you did considerably more than assist. The hallway was quiet around them, the ordinary mid-morning quiet of a hospital floor between crises. Why didn't you do anything about it before now? Nia asked, not accusingly. She genuinely wanted to understand the calculation. Because a folder of irregularities without a clean incident is a complaint, Han said. And a complaint against a 22-year department chief in this hospital gets managed at the administrative level and disappears. What happened this morning is different. He filed a formal falsification accusation against a colleague in front of the full board using manufactured discrepancies. That's not a complaint. That's a case. And cases don't disappear the same way complaints do. She looked at Nia steadily. I needed him to overreach. I didn't manufacture the opportunity, but I was ready for it when he created it. You've been waiting for him to do exactly this. I've been waiting for him to do exactly this to exactly the right person, Han said. Someone whose documentation was thorough enough to survive scrutiny. Someone who'd been careful enough, patient enough, and skilled enough that the accusation would collapse the moment the evidence was actually examined. She paused. I'm sorry it had to be you. I'm not sorry you were the one. Nia turned back to the window. Processed what she was being told, the shape of it, the long patience it represented, a senior woman in a difficult institution, building a file over 22 months, waiting for a moment clean enough to use it without it being buried. It was, she recognized, not entirely different from what she'd been doing with her own encrypted folder for 3 weeks. What happens to the patients? Nia asked. The cases in your folder, did any of them? 3 adverse outcomes, I believe, are connected to the procedural shortcuts documented in the folder, Han said quietly. Nothing that can be proven to the standard of criminal negligence, enough to establish a pattern of conduct that the board cannot responsibly ignore once it's formally in front of them. She paused. There are families who deserve to know that what happened to their person wasn't simply an unavoidable complication. I've carried that for 22 months. It's one of the reasons I wasn't willing to let this folder sit any longer than it had to. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling between them in the way that weight settles between 2 people who both understand the full size of what they're holding. The board chair appeared in the conference room doorway. We're ready to resume. Nia set down the coffee she'd never poured and walked back into the room. The board's decision took 11 minutes to read into the record. Dr. Choi Byung-soo's surgical privileges were suspended effective immediately, pending a full review of the cases documented in Director Han's folder. The falsification complaint against Dr. Cole was formally withdrawn and expunged from the record. The hospital's patient safety committee was to be notified within 24 hours, as required by the applicable regulatory standards for any finding of potential procedural irregularity affecting patient outcomes. Choi didn't speak during the reading. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the specific stillness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. When the board chair finished, Choi stood, straightened his jacket, and left the room without a word to anyone, the exit of a man who'd spent 22 years leaving rooms on his own terms and was leaving this one the same way out of sheer reflex, even though nothing about what had just happened was on his terms at all. The room exhaled. Dr. Park looked at Nia across the table with the expression of a man who'd spent an hour watching something he was going to be thinking about for a while. The comparative analysis you ran, he said, 3 weeks ago, on your own time. Yes, Nia said. That kind of forensic documentation isn't standard practice for attending surgeons, he said. No, she agreed, but I was trained to follow a clinical question to its source, regardless of where the source turned out to be. I didn't run that analysis because I was planning to use it against anyone. I ran it because something in the data bothered me and I needed to understand why. And when you understood why? I put it in an encrypted file, Nia said, and spent 3 weeks deciding whether the cost of using it was one I was prepared to pay. What made you prepare it this morning? He asked. Before you knew this meeting was about you. Nia looked at him steadily. I came in 40 seconds late, she said. The room was already looking at me before I'd set my bag down. I've been the only black woman on this surgical floor for 2 years. I know what a room that's already decided something looks like. I opened my tablet before I sat down. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people absorbing a statement they hadn't prepared a response for. Director Han spoke into it. I'd like to recommend to the board that the department chief position, which will need to be filled during Dr. Choi's suspension and any subsequent restructuring, be offered on an interim basis to Dr. Cole, effective at the start of next month. Interim, Nia said. To begin, Han said, and the slight emphasis on to begin was as deliberate as every other word she'd chosen all morning. The board chair looked around the table. Objections. Nobody objected. Then we'll formalize the offer through HR by end of week, he said, and looked at Nia with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Dr. Cole, I want to say, on behalf of this board, that the manner in which you handled both the clinical situation and this morning's proceedings reflects a standard of professional conduct this department should have been offering you as a baseline, rather than something you had to demonstrate under these circumstances. I'm sorry we're having this conversation in this order. I appreciate that, Nia said. I'll need to review the terms of the interim offer before I respond to it. Of course, the board chair said. Including compensation, she said. I'd like to discuss that directly with Director Han before anything is formalized. Han's expression moved almost imperceptibly towards something that, on a less controlled face, would have been a smile. My office, 4 o'clock. The meeting adjourned at 11:34 a.m. Nia walked out of the conference room and down the corridor to the elevator and stood inside it while the doors closed and the floor numbers descended, alone for the first time since she'd walked into that room. She let herself feel, privately and completely, what she hadn't let herself feel in front of any of them, the full force of what the morning had been, the specific exhaustion of having been ready for a fight she shouldn't have needed to be ready for, the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who had to document everything twice, because once was never going to be sufficient. The elevator opened on the surgical floor. She had 3 cases this afternoon. The first started in 40 minutes. She walked to the scrub room, changed, and stood at the sink running water over her hands, the familiar pre-surgical ritual that had been the most reliable constant in her professional life since her first year of residency. Her hands were completely steady. They always were, once she was in the room where the actual work happened. Whatever else a day contained, whatever a conference room tried to do to her before noon, her hands were always steady by the time the work began. She intended to keep it that way, in this hospital, in this department, at the level she was about to negotiate for herself at 4 o'clock in Director Han's office. Not because they'd offered it to her. Because she'd walked into a room that had been arranged as her ending, and had conducted herself with such thorough, documented, unassailable precision that the room had been left with no reasonable alternative but to offer her the chair at the head of it. She'd earned it 3 weeks ago, alone, at midnight, running an analysis nobody had asked for on a complication nobody expected her to follow. The offer this morning was just the paperwork. Coming next, the 4 o'clock meeting with Director Han, the salary negotiation, what Choi does when the suspension becomes public, and how Nia closes this. Subscribe now, we are getting to the very end of the fascinating story. Like and comment which scene touched your heart. Director Han's office was on the 9th floor, corner position, 2 walls of glass looking out over a city that had no idea what had happened 7 floors below it that morning. Nia arrived at 3:58, because arriving early communicated eagerness and arriving late communicated disorganization, and she was neither of those things today specifically. Han was already at her desk, jacket off, reading something she closed when Nia knocked. A small detail that meant something, a woman who closed what she was reading when someone arrived, was a woman who understood that attention was a form of respect. Sit, Han said, then almost immediately. Before we discuss terms, I want to know how you are, not professionally, actually. Nia sat down and considered the question honestly, which was what it deserved. Tired, she said. The kind of tired that doesn't come from this morning specifically. The kind that comes from 2 years of this morning in smaller versions, accumulating. Han nodded once, the nod of a woman who knew exactly what that particular tiredness felt like from the inside. I've been at this hospital for 17 years, she said. I've sat in that conference room for 11 of them. I've watched 7 women, Korean women, mind you, not foreign women, just women, leave this department in my tenure because the accumulation you just described became heavier than the work was worth. She folded her hands on the desk. I didn't want you to be the 8th. I wasn't planning to be, Nia said. I know, that's why we're having this conversation instead of a farewell dinner. Han opened a folder, a different one from the morning, thinner, formal. The interim department chief offer. Let me tell you what's in it before you tell me what's wrong with it. The base figure was 15% above Nia's current attending salary. Administrative budget authority up to a defined ceiling. A dedicated PA for scheduling and departmental correspondence. A title review at 6 months with a path to permanent appointment contingent on board approval. Nia let Han finish before she said anything. The base is wrong, she said. I expected you'd say that. Dr. Choi's compensation package for the department chief role is on file with HR, Nia said. I looked it up this morning, between the board meeting and my first case, which I realize tells you something about how I spent my lunch break. His base is 31% above my current salary, not 15. She held Han's gaze. I'm not asking for 31% because he earned that number. I'm asking for it because the role commands it, and accepting less establishes a compensation baseline for this position that will outlast my tenure and effect, whoever holds it after me. Han was quiet for a moment. You're negotiating for your successor. I'm negotiating for the position, Nia said. My successor benefits from that, yes. So does the department's credibility when it's trying to recruit at the level it wants to recruit at. A department chief salary that's 15% above attending rate tells the market this hospital doesn't fully value the role. That's a recruiting problem that has nothing to do with me personally. You've thought about this for longer than this morning, Han said. I've thought about compensation architecture in this department for 8 months, Nia said. After I noticed, in my second year, that 3 of the 4 female attendings were sitting below the median salary band for their experience level, while every male attending at equivalent experience was at or above it. I didn't say anything about it then because I didn't have the standing to say it in a way that would be heard rather than managed. I have the standing now. Han opened a different drawer, pulled out a single page, and slid it across the desk. It was a salary audit summary. Nia could see that much before she turned it to read it properly, and it was dated 14 months ago. I commissioned this quietly, Han said, after noticing the same pattern you just described. The findings were consistent with what you observed. I've been waiting for a structural moment to address it, a leadership transition, a departmental review, something that would make compensation correction look like standard restructuring rather than an admission of systematic underpayment that the hospital's legal team would reflexively try to minimize. She tapped the page. This morning was that moment. If I restructure compensation across the department as part of the leadership transition, the correction is procedurally clean. Nia looked at the audit summary. The numbers were worse than she'd calculated on her own. Not dramatically worse, but consistently, deliberately, institutionally worse, in the specific way that suggested the pattern had never been accidental. 31%, Nia said again. 31%, Han confirmed. And the administrative ceiling needs to come up. I'll propose 20% above what's in the initial offer. The board will negotiate down, and will land somewhere that's still a meaningful improvement over what's there now. What do you need from me to make the permanent appointment recommendation at 6 months? Nia asked. What you've been doing for 2 years, Han said simply. Documented, thorough, patient-centered work that makes it professionally indefensible for this board to recommend anyone else. She paused. And I need you to start filing incident reports when you find things that should be reported. No more professional courtesies that protect people who aren't extending the same courtesy to you. Your instinct to be fair is one of your best qualities. In this department, going forward, it needs a boundary. Agreed, Nia said. They spent another 40 minutes on the remaining terms. Case assignment protocols, department meeting structure, a mentorship program for junior residents that Nia had been wanting to propose for a year, and now had the platform to implement. Han pushed back on 2 things and conceded on 4, which told Nia that the pushback was genuine rather than reflexive, which made the concessions mean something. At 5:20, they shook hands across the desk. "One more thing," Han said, as Nia stood to leave. "Choi's suspension becomes public record tomorrow when the Patient Safety Committee notification goes out. The press will have it by afternoon. Reporters will call the hospital's communications office, and communications will refer them to me, and I will refer them to a prepared statement. I want you to know that your name will be in that statement, accurately, as the surgeon whose work identified the clinical irregularity that prompted the review. Not as the subject of a complaint, as the physician whose documentation made the review possible." Nia considered that for a moment. Some people will read it as me going after a senior colleague. "Some people will read it that way regardless of what the statement says," Han said. "The clinical record says something different, and the clinical record is what this hospital stands behind." She held Nia's gaze. "You didn't go after him. He handed you a room full of witnesses and you made sure they understood what they were witnessing. There's a meaningful difference, and this hospital's public statement will reflect it." Nia took the elevator back down to the surgical floor, changed out of her scrubs from the afternoon cases, and sat in the small attending lounge for a few minutes before calling her mother in Baltimore. Her mother answered on the second ring. "How was your day?" her mother said, the way she always said it, not quite a question, more an invitation. "Long," Nia said. "Mama, I need to tell you about this morning." Her mother listened without interrupting. It was her mother's particular gift, the same one she'd been exercising since Nia was 7 years old, and came home from school with stories about rooms that hadn't been built to include her, the capacity to receive a whole thing before responding to any part of it. When Nia finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "The folder you kept," her mother said finally. "The encrypted one, 3 weeks." "Yes. You knew you might need it." "I thought I might," Nia said. "I didn't know I'd need it for this specific thing. I just knew, I've always known, in rooms like that one, that the only leverage I reliably have is my own documentation. Nobody can take away what I recorded accurately before they decided to come after me." "I taught you that," her mother said quietly. "You did," Nia said. "8th grade, Mrs. Patterson's class. You told me to write everything down and date it and keep it somewhere she couldn't reach. You said the same thing every time after that, whenever a room tried to rewrite what happened in it." "And did it work?" Nia looked out the window of the attending lounge at a sole evening coming in over the city, the lights beginning their nightly arrangement against a sky going dark at the edges. "Department chief," she said. "Effective next month, 31%. Her mother made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something that needed a moment to finish itself. "Baby," she said when it had, "go eat something. You sound like you haven't eaten since yesterday." "I haven't eaten since yesterday." "Then eat first," her mother said. "Be proud of yourself second, in that order." Nia smiled, the first full smile since before the meeting, the private kind that didn't need an audience. "Yes, Mama," she said. The story didn't end cleanly the way stories in films ended, with a single culminating moment where everything resolved and the credits rolled, and the room that had tried to diminish her stood corrected in one clean beat. It ended the way real things ended, in accumulations. Choi's suspension became public the next afternoon, exactly as Han had said it would. The statement named Nia accurately. Some people read it the way Han had predicted some people would. Most people who actually worked in the hospital read the clinical record, which said something different and said it without ambiguity. Choi did not return to Seoul Central. The review found 3 additional cases beyond the ones in Han's folder that warranted further investigation, and by the time the Patient Safety Committee had finished its work, the finding was thorough enough that reinstatement was never seriously discussed. 2 of the 3 families Han had mentioned, the ones connected to adverse outcomes in the folder, were notified through the hospital's patient relations process. It was inadequate, Nia thought, and said so in the departmental review meeting where it was discussed. Han agreed with her and said so on record. The process improved, marginally, which was how institutional processes always improved marginally, and because someone with standing refused to stop pushing. At 6 months, the permanent appointment came through. The board voted unanimously, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention to the department's outcomes data, and which surprised several people who hadn't been. Nia accepted in writing, one line, thanking the board for their confidence, and nodding that she looked forward to building a department whose documentation standards made the kind of review they'd conducted in January unnecessary to conduct again. It was, Director Han told her afterward, the most pointed acceptance letter she'd ever seen submitted to a hospital board. Was that intentional? Han asked. Every word I write is intentional, Nia said. You told me that yourself, 14 months ago, without knowing you were telling me. Han looked at her. I haven't spoken to you in 14 months. No, Nia agreed. But you commissioned a salary audit and kept it in your desk waiting for the right moment. That told me everything I needed to know about how to operate in this building. Document accurately. Be patient. Wait for the moment that's clean enough to use. She paused. I just happened to learn it by watching you instead of by you telling me directly. Han was quiet for a moment, something moving briefly across her careful face. You're going to be very difficult to manage, she said. I'm not here to be managed, Nia said. I'm here to run a surgical department. Those are different jobs. Yes, Han said, and this time the almost smile arrived completely, briefly. The first fully unguarded expression Nia had seen from her across 5 months of careful alliance. They are. Dr. Nia Cole had come to Seoul Central 2 years earlier following the work, the way she always followed the work, past the edge of comfort, into rooms that hadn't been built with her in mind, with nothing but her documentation and her discipline, and the steady hands her mother had told her once were going to take her somewhere that required them. She hadn't come looking for a fight. She'd come prepared for one, the way a surgeon comes prepared for every complication she hopes she won't encounter and knows she might. Instruments ready, documentation thorough, hands steady, waiting. The room had given her exactly what it thought would end her. She'd simply made sure everyone present understood what they were actually handing her.